Okay. I mean, good for you if you tried to slog through some of that reading from Aristotle. As I said, we had students at the University of Virginia read several of Plato's dialogues, the Apology, the Meno, the Crito, that we read some parts of. But we usually don't assign Aristotle to first-year philosophy students. And one reason is we don't think his actual works, which presumably read much better than what we have, we don't think his actual works survive. What we have are compendiums of lecture notes, so they're not read to be smooth, they're not real smooth, organized presentations. Plus, on top of that, even when translators try to smooth them out, they can do only so much. So Aristotle is kind of hard slogging. In this PowerPoint, which was pretty much built up from Aristotle's primary work, I'm going to at least get out the basics of his virtue ethics. And this is not just of historical interest. A number of traditions, including the Christian tradition, talk about ethics not just in terms of, say, principles. We shouldn't murder, we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't lie, stuff like that. But a number of traditions, not just the Greek tradition, also worry about ethics in terms of what kind of person should we be if we're going to be an ethical person, a morally just person. And another way of saying that is what character traits, characterize is a little redundant, but what character traits should someone who is living an excellent life, who is a morally good person, what character traits should that person possess? And Plato and Socrates were concerned with that. If you look at their writings on ethics, a lot of the concern has to do with moral virtues like self-control, like courage, wisdom, things like that. And Aristotle takes this a step further. Aristotle not only talks about moral virtues, but he he talks about virtues and gives us a model of a moral virtue. But you know what? I just remembered something. I did not finish up. Since I started Aristotle, let me go through Aristotle, but I do want to talk some about the allegory of the cave and how it relates to Plato on the forms. But we'll see that Aristotle has a different definition of ultimate ethical goodness. Now, one of the things, if you done the readings, that we see is that in Plato you have, as far as he was concerned, eternal standards not only for what makes something a triangle or for what makes something a circle or a number or for what makes something a chair or a desk, but he also thought there were eternal standards for more abstract qualities like moral virtue, justice, and especially moral goodness. For Plato, the area outside the cave represents the intellectual world, and okay, so before I go more into Aristotle, let me finish up a few things on that. Hold it. I need to finish this off. So we did the epistemological argument for the forms. I thought I'd pause this. Right, the argument that says these ultimate standards need to be there because they are what true knowledge is about. That is, the knowledge of the slave boy about geometry is not knowledge of the imperfect drawings that Socrates is drawing on the ground, if we back up for a few moments. But what he has knowledge of is the perfect standards for what a triangle is, the perfect standards for what squares are. In other words, Plato thinks there is a realm separate from this world where these things actually exist in a very real sense of existence. And so what the slave boy actually has knowledge of, argues Socrates, is things he has experienced in this other realm. And that's why Socrates says, well, look, if the boy is answering my questions right about geometry, then clearly he has learned principles of geometry, but that would mean either he had to learn it in this life or in a previous life. Remember, Socrates and Plato both believed in reincarnation. And Socrates says, well, wait a second, this is a slave boy. He's never had a formal education, and so he's never had any formal teaching in geometry. So he clearly did not learn geometry in this life. So Socrates argues that his soul must have learned the basic principles of geometry before it became incarnated in its present body. And that would be by coming into direct contact with the eternal standards, the eternal truths that Plato calls forms in what he calls the intelligible or the intellectual world. So the argument is the slave boy's knowledge can't be about fleeting, changing things like Socrates' sand drawings. I'm going past this fast because I think we already talked about it. But it has to be of eternal things like the forms of those. In other words, think of it in terms of a blueprint, right? You can have the blueprint of a house as the ideal standard for what you want the house to be and to look like. And from that blueprint, you could go on to make a whole row of houses that fit that blueprint, right? And this is kind of the way Plato construes a form, as it's like an ideal blueprint. And for him, in this other realm, there's an ideal blueprint for what a triangle is, what a square is. And so knowledge for him is of what is perfect and eternal in this realm. No particular triangle or square is perfect, right? Even if it's an equilateral triangle, if you're drawing it even with good instruments, it's still not going to be perfect. No two lines are perfectly equal. I might have mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. Socrates argues elsewhere in the Phaedo that, suppose we drew two lines on the blackboard, or the way I used to illustrate it when I had real blackboards and I carried chalk with me is, take two pieces of chalk out of the box, right, that haven't been used at all. Well, they're pretty much equal in length. But you and I know if we had a sensitive enough measuring instrument, probably some kind of a laser assisted instrument, we could see that two pieces of chalk that look equal in length are really not perfectly equal in length. One's going to be just slightly longer than the other. So no two things are perfectly equal in this world. But Socrates says, how can we make an ordinary judgment like two lines are equal but not perfectly equal unless we already know what perfect equality is? But Socrates would go on to say, well, we didn't learn what perfect equality is through our senses in this world, because there aren't any two things anywhere in this world that are perfectly equal. So where do we learn it? In the realm of the forms. So again, what we're supposed to assume is going on there with Socrates and the slave boy is that he's not teaching him geometry, but merely asking questions. This is the Socratic method. And he's supposedly bringing out knowledge that this boy had. So for Plato, what we call knowledge, we claim to know particular facts, like there is a cup of water in front of me. That's a particular fact, right? It's true now, it could be false an hour from now. But for Plato, real knowledge is of what is not only true, but eternally true and unchanging, like the truths of mathematics, like moral concepts, goodness, justice, holiness. He thinks these have eternal standards. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people who disagree and have, but we're trying to understand Plato. So, if knowledge is going to be stable and unchanging, it has to be of objects that are stable and unchanging, namely of these perfect entities, the forms. And we talk of them as the X itself, like the square itself, or the property of squareness. And as I think I said last time, if you want to make this view a little more believable to you, ask yourself something like this. Did what it is to be a square or a triangle just come into existence when the first human maybe drew a triangle on a cave wall somewhere or whatever? Or did they somehow discover or latch on to a standard that was already there for what makes a square, or a triangle. Well, if you're tempted to answer the latter, then you can see how Plato can think that these are eternally existing standards and entities already there. So he talks then as if there is a perfect square in this realm of the forms that functions as a blueprint for every other square in the world. Similar for concepts like piety or holiness. I'm going to go past this because we didn't read the Euthyphro. But that's what knowledge is supposedly about. And so here he says, the world of the forms agrees with Parmenides' conception of what true reality was, that it was supposed to be eternal and unchanging and perfect. So the epistemological argument for the forms, I think we went over some of these slides, says the forms must be there if we can ever have true knowledge. True knowledge has to be about something like the forms as the objects of that true knowledge. Now, there's two more arguments I want to go that aren't nearly as involved. The metaphysical argument for the forms does what the 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine called this an argument for the reification of universals. Universals and forms it's kind of two words of referring to the same thing, not exactly, but universal standards. In other words, a universal standard for what a triangle is or for what justice is. And so metaphysics it's the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality. And one question it considers is whether there is anything universal in the world, general and universal, or are the only things that exist particular things? In other words, take the desks you're sitting at. Are the only things that exist in the world particular desk, or is there a universal general standard for what makes a desk a desk? Well, for Plato, the answer would be the latter to that. So this argument basically says if two particular things share a common characteristic, then that common characteristic that they share exists as a real thing independent of the particular things. In other words, that there are general objects, like the standards for what a square is, or call it the property of squareness. In other words, these two squares you see pictured in this PowerPoint, these two particular shares share in common the property of squareness. So the metaphysical argument for the form says if two things share a common property, then we need to conclude that that property actually has an existence. So it may, what Quine called this an argument for the reification of universals, because it's an argument that makes these universal properties like squareness that a number of particular squares can share, it makes that universal property real. Socrates talks about largeness as another example. Two large things share the property in common. So that's another argument that's given for why we should think that the forms are actually there. Because remember, Plato is trying to convince us of something that stands on its head, our normal concepts about the world and what exists in the world, right? I told you, my geometry teachers at Poly, if they knew, just like Plato knew, that there weren't any perfect triangles in this world, but when they talked about a perfect triangle, they talked about it as a humanly constructed object, as an object in our imagination, basically as an imaginary triangle that didn't have any more existence than, say, a unicorn, an imaginary creature, had. Plato's trying to convince us not only that the forms exist, but they exist in a more fully real state than anything in this world. See, for Plato, this is the world of becoming. I think I mentioned that last time. This is Heraclitus' world of constant change and flux. In other words, things in this world are never stably what they are and nothing else, but they're constantly becoming something else. So in a sense, they both are and are not at the same time. They are what they are, but they're constantly changing to something else. And so Plato says things in this fleeting material world are less real than the eternal objects in the world of the forms. So contrast this with the way my geometry teachers, who were constructivists in mathematics, objects like perfect triangles are just human constructions. For Plato, no. Objects like a perfect triangle are eternally existing objects that are more real than anything in this present world. And we're going to relate it to the cave before we finish. So the semantic argument for the forms, semantics is the area of philosophy and logic that deals with the meaning and reference of words, of terms we use. And Victor Morawski is a proper name that singles out one particular individual in this room, right? As your proper name does. Now, look at the slide. I mean, suppose Gertrude was a circus elephant, and we don't know if there are going to be any more circus elephants, but suppose she was, or in a zoo somewhere, where somebody gave her a name. This elephant here is Gertrude. Right. In other words, Gertrude here is the proper name of a particular elephant. Whatever you name your pet is the proper name of that pet that singles out a particular pet. But what about the general word, the general term elephant, that a number of particular elephants, that indicates a property shared by a number of particular elephants? Well, Plato's claim is that names for the forms, like elephant or largeness or squareness, that those are proper names of forms. So general words are the proper names of general entities, namely the forms in this other world. So for Plato, like Parmenides, he wants to rid us of our bias toward the senses. He says, look, it's not the senses but your reason that's going to put you in touch with these eternal entities. And that's what we ought to be about as philosophers. This is why they elevate reason. Using our reasoning faculty to learn more about them in this life, to try to remember what we already knew in a previous life. Now obviously these are claims that are hard to back up, right? But I'm not asking you to buy what Plato is selling necessarily here, but he does raise an issue about whether or not there are any standards for things like moral qualities that are more than just human standards. Are some of the things that are out there things that we discover rather than things that we invent. So once rid of our bias toward the senses, we see that things like beauty itself, equality, these forms aren't simply imaginary entities, and for him they're more real. So there's the world of the senses, which is this colored world down below, and then there's this intellectual world where the forms exist for Plato. And the forms also have whatever properties they have they perfectly have, okay? And take I have a friend, back the same friend, who's really into, or at least used to be really into these shows, The Real Housewives of X, whether X is Atlanta or New Jersey or wherever, right? And The Real Housewives of X are really into beautiful things, right? And this is what Plato says of people in his own community. He says, well, ordinary people worry about beautiful things and acquiring them and all. But he says the philosopher ought to look beyond that and worry about beauty itself. Because any beautiful thing, like take this rose, it might be beautiful, but it's not perfectly beautiful, right? It's not going to be eternally beautiful. I mean, the rose may have a few dark spots on it if you look at it closely, maybe a misshapen petal here and there, maybe it's missing a petal. And we know if it's a real rose, it's not going to look the same a week or two from now, even if you put it in water, than it did the day you get it, right? But for Plato, the form of beauty is itself perfectly beautiful. So I realize this is a little hard to see. So the form of squareness would be perfectly square, and you can kind of fill in the rest of the story. So I'm not going to labor on the distinctions. So we're in the world of sense experience, contains objects which exist and don't exist at the same time because they're always in the state of transitioning, of becoming something else. Always in a perennial state of becoming. And that's the world the pre-Socratic philosopher talked about. And Plato says that's true of this world. But he says ultimate reality is like Parmenides' world. Changeless and eternal, contains objects which are forever the same, that don't change, right, and that are more real. So basically, Plato's view is that both Parmenides and Heraclitus were half right and half wrong. Heraclitus was right about this world, but wrong that this world represents ultimate reality. Heraclitus was wrong about this world, but he was right about ultimate reality and its characteristics, that things need to be perfect and eternal and unchanging. But what Heraclitus didn't realize was that that world of ultimate reality is not this world that the senses put us in touch with, but is in fact a world beyond the senses. Now, I don't think your book discusses the divided line much, but again, basically, this can get us into talking about some of the other meanings of the allegory of the cave, because I realized that was what I wanted to do today, and not go directly into Aristotle. As likenesses are to what they are likenesses of, so things in this world are related to the forms. So think of it this way: shadows are imperfect copies, imperfect likenesses of, say, the objects that are carried, or a real object like this pillar, right? See the shadow of the pillar there? That's why I chose this picture. But for Plato, there's a perfect standard for what makes a pillar, and that's in the world beyond the senses, in the world of the forms. Likewise, as the shadow of an eagle is to the eagle which casts it, so the eagle is related to the form eagle. In other words, for Plato, things in this world, the concrete things in this world, like the desk, are a combination of a perfect form and imperfect matter. And that's why they're imperfect, right? So the forms are not only in this perfect world, but they are also, the technical jargon is, instantiated in particular objects. So in some way, for Plato, the form of deskness is in every desk in this room. But it also, for him, exists apart from a particular desk in another realm. So let me, since I now remembered what I wanted to do, which was not go right into Aristotle, let me open up something here. That's not this PC. Okay, well, let's see. Okay, so USB drive, and boy, let me see, because I'm not sure. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, wait a second. I just saw what I want. Yeah, there it is. Okay, sorry, folks. I should have gotten here a little earlier. I had forgotten. I thought I was going to go right into that. I had forgotten. I hadn't put it. No. This is a handout that's already there for you in Blackboard, in a separate. And what it does is it talks about the meanings of the allegory of the cave, and the center one is something we've already discussed in a lot of detail. The meaning of it for an illustration of the critical function of philosophy in having us challenge our unreflected beliefs, ask the reasons for them, and revise or reject some of them. The way philosophy challenges us to do that. But Plato also meant it to be a story about his two-tiered theory of reality. So let me run through this quickly. But the cave, then, in other words, talking about the way the allegory represents Plato's view of reality. Everything inside the cave represents this world, right? So the prisoners obviously are us in this world, and here the chains. I like to say it is: do we have a choice about being, as Madonna would say it, material boys and girls in the material world, right? We don't have a choice, right? We're in the material world whether we like it or not. We're material beings. Right, so the chains represent the fact that, hey, we're material beings in the material world. We can't get away from that fact. So what are the shadows? Well, basically, if things inside the cave represent things in this world, the shadows are any images we might have of things in this world, whether it be a reflection in water or in a mirror of something, whether it be a shadow of something, or even a humanly constructed representation like a statue or a painting. For Plato, all those representations, including anything the visual arts produces, are twice removed from reality, right? They are a copy of a copy. So why do you say that they're twice removed from reality? Well, suppose you're talking about a statue carried by one of the people in the cave, right, at the fire. The shadow is a very imperfect copy of the statue, right? But for Plato, the particular statue is an imperfect particular copy of the form of a statue in this other realm. Maybe a statue is not the best way to say it, but maybe. But so the shadows then represent any kind of images of things in this world, and this might give you an idea. Do you think Plato would have a very high view of the visual arts, or not such a high view of them, or would he have had much of an opinion? Well, think about it. As we said, the things. Say you have a drawing of a table. Well, that drawing of a table is an imperfect copy, an imperfect representation of the table that you were looking at when you drew the table. So, in that sense, it's removed from reality because for Plato, the actual table you looked at is more real than your imperfect copy of it in your drawing. But look at it again. For Plato, there's an eternal standard for what makes a table in the realm of the forms. And any particular table, like the table you looked at when you drew the table, is only an imperfect copy of the perfect standard for what a table is in the realm of the forms. So the items that people are carrying then are like material objects in this world. But see, we're like the prisoners of the cave in another sense. Not only did we grow up in a particular intellectual environment, but as I already said, like Madonna, we're living in the material world here, right? And we can't get out of that. But But like the prisoners in the cave, we tend to think material things, these kinds of things that we can sense and feel, are the most real things, like the material desk you're sitting on. But Plato is trying to say, no, they're just imperfect material copies of the perfect standard for a desk in the realm of the forms. So what is the fire? Here's where it gets tricky in interpreting this. Say, well, it's already pretty tricky. Yeah, well, it gets trickier. The fire inside the cave, what do you think that represents? In other words, if the cave represents this world, what do you think the fire inside the cave would represent? I mean, this is not rocket science, folks. This is simpler than it seems. What gives light and heat to things in this world, right? The sun, right? So the fire inside the cave represents the sun. The sensible world is this world, the world our senses put us in touch with. Not sensible in the sense that we say, oh, you know, she's a real sensible woman. No. Here, sensible means able to be experienced by the senses, able to be an object of sense experience. So the released prisoner, again, is the philosopher or the philosophy student, the budding young philosopher. The prisoners remaining in the cave are, you know, people out there. And in Socrates' day, it was the ordinary people of Athens who didn't want to listen to what he had to say philosophically. So the journey is still a philosophical journey, but now when we get out of the cave, okay, the cave represents things in this world. Remember, Plato's got two worlds in his complicated theory of reality. Once we get out of the cave, we are theoretically in the realm of the forms, the part that reason puts us in touch with in this life, you know. So we're in the intellectual world, or the intelligible world. Now, we saw that the person who was released progressively could see more and more things in it, till finally he could behold what? Not just objects in this world lit by the sun in the outside world, but he could behold the sun itself. Now again, folks, don't try this at home, right? You can ruin your eyes for life staring at the sun. What do you think the sun represents? Now this is harder. I have it down there. Plato thinks there's a hierarchy in the forms where the more abstract the form is a form of, the higher the form. And I don't want to go into that, but in other words, a form for something more abstract like a triangle has a higher degree of existence than the form of a desk. But Plato has a head honcho form, the form of the good or goodness itself, the ultimate standard for moral goodness. And this is an excellent place to end because it transitions into Aristotle's virtue ethics. That's what the sun outside the cave represents. In other words, if the fire inside the cave represents the sun, the question is, what does the sun represent? Well, the sun represents this head honcho form, the most fully existing thing for Plato, the ultimate standard for moral goodness, the form of the good with a capital G. Okay, thank you so much. And again, in the event the world doesn't end tomorrow, we will see you on Monday, you know. But if it does end tomorrow, then you're excused from class on Monday. You know, we'll cancel it, right? If we're being bombarded by all sorts of calamities to my Saturday. Okay, let me stop.